In this video, we're going to be going over the squatting movement pattern. Think about different cueing, how to approach variations of squats. Now, when we talk about squatting movement patterns or the movement pattern of being able to perform a squat, we're going to first go over the very traditional back squat with a barbell and just talk about cueing. Because when we start to look at different variations, that's when you start seeing the modifications in the movement pattern and how you're approaching different cues and where the weight is just distributed and so forth. So first we take a look at the back squat. Not necessarily that every program has to have a back squat, but that's usually the fundamental, whether it's a body weight squat or a back squat. Those are the fundamental squatting patterns that you normally discuss first, and then you start to modify or look at variations beyond that. So first, looking at a back squat pattern. Now we'll look at both the front view and the lateral view for different squats, different types of squats that we'll go through in this presentation. I like to go through the lateral view first and discuss just very fundamental cueing. And then we'll look at how it, not necessarily how it changes, but how you can observe it or how you can visualize this movement pattern from a head-on or more of a front view perspective. So looking at the pattern first, and I do have this up in YouTube, so when I pause it, I'll have to click exit off of like the more video section. So first and foremost, when you're approaching the lift itself, make sure you find a grip. So I'll backtrack a tiny bit and I'll actually annotate my mouse so I can kind of draw and all this different stuff on here. So first things first, when you're approaching the bar, find the grip that works for you. Normally, some people will recommend pretty much where you bench or a tiny bit closer in from where you would normally bench press, if that means anything to you. For me, it's a tiny bit wider than shoulder width. Depending on your shoulder mobility, you might be able to go a little bit closer, get a little bit more snug. But for the typical person, it's probably a little bit wider than shoulder width. If you go farther than that on the bar, and you can kind of see on this left-hand side, the more you may drift out, right? Let's use drawings. The more you drift out, if you start to push this grip out farther, right, the more strain it's going to place on this bicep, because anytime you're holding the bar in, right, you're thinking about driving your elbows down, thinking about tucking your lats, but you're also driving your arms or your hands inward to you. So as you're driving down and bringing your arms inward to you, it is utilizing the bicep, it's utilizing the back, the lats to be able to keep that bar tucked and stable. So the farther your hands are, right, the farther your hands are, the more strain it's going to place on those biceps. So just something to keep in mind, as well as the farther this bar is, or the farther your hands are out, sometimes the farther that bar will set for you to stay stable. And then we start getting into variations of low bar squatting and stuff like that. And that's a whole different approach from anywhere from setup to stabilizing to where your torso is, the angle of your torso as you go through the depth of the squat. So we won't discuss that throughout this video, but I just want you to take note that where your hand placement is on the bar is going to be a huge factor in how you're approaching this squatting pattern. So first things first, you make sure you have a clear area. Nothing's in the way, especially when you unrack the bar, you step out, right? Nothing's in your way. Very clear, very stable, sound surface, plenty of grip for your feet and so forth. In these videos, I'll actually be in socks and not in shoes because, and I always say this, so you can see what the ankles and the feet are doing. And I say this very loosely. It's not always appropriate to train or lift without appropriate footwear. But from a demonstration perspective, I always try and key in on what the ankles are doing, what the knees are doing, what the hips are doing. So I really try and highlight those pieces. So I try to eliminate some of the attire that's going to hinder your ability to observe what's going on during the movement. So moving forward, again, I know where I'm squatting. I know the area is safe. Surface is great. Then I approach, okay, where are my hands going? So I find where my hands placement, what works for me. And then I actually will start to, and this is depending on how heavy you get, right? Depending on if you're going heavier and heavier throughout this movement, the more stable and really sound you have to be. But I try to treat every single set as if it was super heavy and approach it the exact same. I want the heavyweight to look as smooth as the lightweight and the lightweight to be as sound as the heavyweight from a stability perspective. So I try and approach every single set as fundamentally the same as possible. So what I'll actually do is I try and wedge the bar as closely in between these two fingers as possible, right? My index, my thumb. I try to wedge the bar and I'll actually kind of tilt the bar and grind the bar into this little slot right here. And so I'll find that grip and then I will lock my hands around. But so just kind of how I approach trying to really get tight with the bar, as well as when you're unracking, when you're getting into the squatting pattern, try not to let your wrists bend as much as possible. You want to keep a neutral, whatever neutral means to you, you try and keep your wrist as straight as possible. Depending on your shoulder mobility, it might not always be the case, but you really try as best you can. So again, I find my hand placement and then I get under the bar and you see it takes a second for me, right? Once I get there, I try and find the right positioning in my on my shoulders, not too low, but not too high. I really don't want it sitting on my neck per se. You really don't want it as high up on your neck. You really want it a little bit more on your traps, a little bit on your rear delts, just right in that groove to be able to provide a platform for the bar to actually sit. If you have it too high up, start having neck discomfort, potentially pain, irritation over time. But you also don't want it too low to where now the bar is placing too much torque, too much issues on your shoulders, right? You want it just right on your shoulders. So kind of play around with what works for you as far as bar placement. I am also, if you notice, let's regroup for a second, you notice I'm getting tight. What you may or may not be able to see is I'm actually pulling the bar. If you think about like a lat pull down or a pull up, something where you're driving something downward, you're driving a resistance downward, and you're really tucking your lats or pulling and tugging on your lats. I'll actually squeeze my lats downward. I think about placing my elbows and tucking my elbows into my pockets, right? I'm really trying to drive my elbows to my hips. Once I get my hand placement, get under the bar, I drive as much as I can, and this creates this not only surface for the bar to sit, but once you're actually going through the squatting pattern, it creates a lot of stability for you. So I'll really try and get tight. I think about squeezing the bar in and down, and it creates this level of support for the movement, especially when you go heavier. And I really try and emphasize this for you to go through that concept, no matter if it's lightweight or heavyweight, really to integrate that aspect of getting stable and prepping for some sort of higher intensity type of load. So again, getting stable, then I will place both feet underneath. This is what works for me. Some people, when it's a lighter weight, they'll just get under the bar and then they'll lift up and they'll scoot back. For me, again, even if it's lightweight, I treat it as if it's heavy. If it's heavyweight, you want to make sure you get both feet under the bar, finds that center for you, and then lift up and then find your way backwards. So I stabilize, I find myself in, a good position for my back, for my arms, for my shoulders. And I find a very sound grip, a very sound sense of stability before I place this other leg underneath, find my center. This is how good I should feel throughout the entirety of the squat. So this is what works for me. This is where I'm at in this racked position. This is how I should feel when I'm stepping out and I'm ready to squat, right? This looks like, if you take this rack away, this looks like I'm about to start the squatting pattern. So that's how I approach getting under the bar, getting set, and getting ready. And so then once I'm ready, I feel the weight, I lift up, and then I find my footing. Now, from a feet perspective, I go a little bit wider than the hips, not too much. The wider you go with your feet, some people might find a little bit of comfort there, but the issue becomes hip mobility and really getting into the depth of your squat. So I go about a little bit wider. You can see on this left side, the front view, if I draw lines here, right? About shoulder width. maybe a tiny bit wider, right? Depending on the angle of this camera, maybe a tiny bit wider. Again, personal preference. I like to go right under shoulders. I like to stay in line just because it allows me to not necessarily only sit back in the squat, but then I can sit down in the squat. So usually when I'm working with individuals, I'll actually have their feet, bring their feet inward and then scoot their toes outward and kind of turn their feet outward about 45 degrees. And you can see that from both images over here, right? You see this left-hand side. Let me clear those real quick. You see this left-hand side, you notice, right? This foot is this way, this foot is that way. They are not pointed straight forward. They are not pointed straight forward, right? If you have them straight forward, it does not allow for your hips to have that little bit of rotation and to open up and allow you to sit in the squat. So you want your toes slightly outward. Rule of thumb is kind of about that 45-degree angle. Don't necessarily have to be exactly that, but it allows for you to actually sit into the squat. So feet placement, about in line with shoulders, maybe a tiny bit wider than shoulders. Again, this depends on the person. Personally, preference for me, I'll actually just in line with my shoulders, in line with my hips, and then I'll turn my feet out slightly. Now, when I'm starting to initiate the squat, you'll notice once I'm set, you'll notice I have soft knees, right? You see that little, it's pretty subtle, but you see here, right? I start to soften my knees. And what that does is it allows my musculature, if your knees are locked, your skeletal system, your bones provide that integrity of a surface. When I soften my knees, I'm cueing my quads, I'm loading my glutes, my hamstrings. Now, you're not going to feel a full stretch, right? Because you're not in the entirety of the lengthening of the musculature. But when I soften my knees, I'm prepping my muscles, I'm prepping my system to go, okay, I'm about to sit back and sit down. I'm about to go through the squatting pattern. So again, I really want you to feel the weight and feel the intensity, even if it's lightweight, still get used to these cues, still get used to these movement patterns. So I soften my knees before I start to initiate. Now, two sides to initiating the squat. I always say, all right, let me create a box right here. When there's a box, right? Let's say this is a seat. When you're finding a seat, and I always compare it to a chair, whatever works for you, right? When I find a seat, I don't just sit straight down, right? I don't literally crash straight down and my knees go forwards and all these things, right? I also don't just plop completely backwards. I want to know the chair's there. So I soften my knees and I push my hips back. I go, okay, where's my chair? And then I sit down in the chair. I want you to approach squatting in the same pattern. Now, this is not a deadlift. This is a squat, right? So a little bit different mechanics with torso and being upright and so forth, but I still want that same concept. Sit back into the squat and then sit down into the squat, right? And really get that feel for finding the box and back up. I also want you to notice, and this will depend on shoulder mobility. And I bring this up a lot because depending on shoulder mobility, you may have a variation in the movement pattern of the bar. Ideally, you want this bar to travel vertically on this y-axis. You want it to travel on this vertical axis straight up and down in an ideal world. Let me go ahead and backtrack. In an ideal world, look at where the bar goes. Loaded on this straight line, right? Tiny bit forwards, but for the most part, staying in this vertical line. And this is also a kind of at a little bit of an angle. So if it was right on track with the bar, for the most part, staying in the vertical line. And the reason I mention this is because let's say you start to initiate this squat here, right? Soft knees, push your hips back. If you have mobility concerns, right, this will completely drive your torso forwards and it will force you as you're starting to squat to completely lean forward. What that will in turn do is two ways of you trying to correct this is you will either fall forward, right? Or you will see a hyperextension. You will see a large curvature in your back trying to maintain that movement pattern. So we want to maintain straight wrists. We want to keep in best case scenario, our forearms will stay in line with our torso. Our elbows will be as under the bar as possible, trying to stabilize that weight. We will maintain a flat back. I always recommend keeping your head neutrals thrown around a ton, but really you want to keep your head tucked and in line. You want to think about from the entirety of your spine. So I'm just drawing all over the place. The entirety of your spine from hip all the way up needs to be a straight line as you're going through. If you look up, if you try and look up, right, you're placing so much strain on the cervical part of your spine, of your neck, right? You're placing a lot of stress on your upper spine. And so the goal is to keep as neutral as spine. And again, neutral thrown around so loosely, but let's just say in line. You try and keep your spine as in line as possible, as it should sit. You shouldn't be looking completely up. In some cases, I see this many times with deadlifting and with cueing with coaches, is they might tell you to make a double chin. They might tell you to tuck your chin. Now, I don't try and emphasize it too much, but I do want to maintain this positioning. We're not looking up. You can tuck your chin, that's okay. But I really don't want you putting a lot of strain, especially if you put a lot of weight. And let's say you don't have the best shoulder mobility to where now it's higher on your neck. You have this hyperextension and you're looking up. You're placing so much stress on that spine. It should be, yes, placing some stress on the spine, but you want most of that load to be absorbed by the musculature. So again, as we're going through, sitting down, right? So this line, literally, if I can move this line, let's see if I can move it, right? Move this line, right? From head to toe as best as possible, right? That's the goal throughout the entirety of the movement pattern. Now, when we look at variations, you see this lean, right? And I can kind of shorten this a little bit, right? You see it, not that it's not that it's a bad lean, but you see in this squatting pattern how it's about maybe in this instance about 45 degrees, right? From this hip, as far as from knee to hip and then hip all the way up through the torso, maybe about 45, maybe 50, maybe 60, right? You see this angle, and that's important when we talk about variations of squatting patterns and being upright and so forth, and the musculature that it taxes. So yeah, talking different cueing. And again, so with the squatting pattern, you want to maintain, you know, staying tight, keeping your elbows tucked, making sure you stay flat, right? From top of your spine all the way through down to your hips. You're sinking not just back. But again, I'll see a lot of modifications I'll have to make is you sit back, but because your feet, you see on this hand side, because your feet are not positioned to where when your knee travels, you can sink down. Most people will sit back in a squat, right? To where they push their hips back and then they get stuck, but they're not able to open up their hips and be able to sit down in the squatting pattern. So let me go ahead and play through this other side. Let's see if I pause there, right? So again, find my positioning. I really try and drive foot positioning about 45 degrees out. Soft knees, I exaggerate it there, right? Boom, soft knees, right? This allows me to feel the weight, feel the intensity of the squat. Think sitting back, sitting down, right? And I'm still maintaining how I always word this, right? If there was something written on this shirt, if there was some kind of font text, if there was a logo, whatever it was, I should be able to read that. You shouldn't be hiding in your squat, right? But you notice my knee placement, right? You notice how I'm able to sit back and down into this squat. Same thing as over here, right? Let's bring it over here. So since I'm able to sit back and down, this is what you notice here, being able to sit in the squat. Now the knees are not pointed straight forward, feet are not pointed straight forward, right? I'm able to sit into this squat. and then back up, right? Nothing changed up top. Top picture should look the same throughout the entirety of the squat. Now, musculature for the squatting pattern, it's whole body, right? Everything is working in this pattern. Let me go ahead and clear all of this. Everything is working in this movement pattern. So as you start to initiate the squat, right, posterior chain in its entirety is working. Your core is helping stabilize, helping you keep upright. If you do not have a strong core, you're going to start to crumble, right? If you don't have a good foundation, talk about houses, infrastructure. If you don't have a good foundation, starts to crumble, starts to break down. Your core, all the way around, not just the front of your abs, right? Like all the way around when we talk about core, helps you stabilize throughout this movement. As you start to sit down, you'll feel a little bit more of a stretch in your hamstrings. Really, as you start to push your hips back and sink lower into the squat, you'll start to feel your glutes. You'll start to feel your hamstrings. Toward the top, sometimes depending on your positioning, if you do a lot of they call high bar squatting, right, and you have a lot more of an upright positioning, then you'll feel a little bit more in your quads. You should feel it all the way around your leg. You should feel in your glutes. You should feel it in your lower body in its entirety. It's not isolating in nature, right? You should feel it for the most part. From a blood flow and buildup, you'll feel it more in your quads and your glutes than you will feel it in your hamstrings, just because hamstrings are a lot more taxing when you're going through hinging patterns, when you're really going through, think hip flexion, hip extension, to where you're going through a full length hinging pattern when we talk about hinging patterns. So you're not going to necessarily feel it, right? When we look at hinges, you do incorporate a hinge, right? When I say push your hips back, that's a hinge. Pushing your hips backwards right here, that's still a hinge. You push your hips backwards, but to an extent, just enough to be able to sit back and then sit down into the squat, right? So it does incorporate hamstrings, pushing your hips back. And then toward the end of the squat, when you're really driven into the bottom of the squat here, right, you do feel a stretch in your hamstrings, but mainly toward the adductors, right? Being able to actually stretch and sit down into the squat. You're not primarily training hamstrings. You're going to feel a lot more quadriceps, a lot more glutes, but hamstrings are trained to an extent throughout the squatting pattern. Now that we went over back squat mechanics, then we can start drifting into discussing different squat variations. Let's see if we can get into the goblet squat. Now, from a posture, and I'll do lateral view, right? Lateral view here, because I want to talk about positioning. Bar path is a lot more straight. I now have, instead of the weight in front, or instead of the weight back here, I'm now able to watch the weight in front of me. So weight distribution wise, I'm now prioritizing my quadriceps. I'm now prioritizing the front of my legs. Doesn't mean you're not going to feel a little bit of glutes just by going through the movement pattern, but for the most part, it is going to be heavily quadricep involved, engaged, so to speak. So as I'm going through the movement pattern, right, the weight's in front of me, I'm upright a lot more, bracing my core a little bit more. The heavier you go, the more you're going to have to utilize your core. What I want you to consider, though, is because I'm holding this weight in front of me, how this changes from a musculature sense. My biceps and my shoulders are having to hold the weight up, or I'm having to hold this in front of me. But then also from a posterior chain or upper back, now it's placing a toll on my upper back to be able to not fall forward, but keep my shoulders back, keep my core engaged, keep my shoulders back, keep that upright positioning. So now, instead of the weight behind us and digging, we're still staying tucked in a way, but now I'm really having to worry about keeping my shoulders back as I go through the pattern. You're able to sink into the squat a little bit more than a back squat per se. Maybe because it's lighter, but primarily since the weight is in front of you, it's kind of countering. When it's behind you, you have to sit back, and it's a difference in movement pattern, how that weight's distributed. But because the weight is in front, you're really able to sink into that squatting pattern. But again, based on weight distribution and then this upright positioning when I mentioned, right? Remember, we'll go back to this positioning here, a lot wider of an angle, right? Because I'm a little bit more upright. The more mobility you have, the more upright you can be. A lot of times with a goblet squat, you'll actually see people place, something on someone's heels, and it'll elevate their heels. And what you will then start to notice is actually this posture. You will be able to have a lot more of an upright positioning in your posture. So you'll be able to sink straight down. And so it just emphasizes you're taking away the aspect of maybe or not maybe, but maybe if you had ankle mobility concerns or what didn't allow you to stay as upright, putting a block under the heels is going to eliminate ankle mobility as a factor. And so now you're really able to stay upright and sink straight down into that squatting pattern. So let's go ahead and drift over here. So picking up the weight. Think soft knees, right? Notice soft knees, sitting down into the squat, right? And able to maintain more of an upright positioning. Same thing with knees though. If you notice, get drawing, right? Same thing if you notice, knees are pointed outwards, a little bit closer of a stance, right? Knees are still traveling over toes. So that's a big thing with squatting patterns. Even though toes aren't pointed forward and they're about 45 degrees out, they're pointed out slightly so you can actually sink into that squatting pattern. Your knees are still going to track over your toes. Now, depending on who you ask, some people will say, well, your knees can't travel past your toes. That depends on how far you have to sit back and sit down into a squat. The main thing is making sure the knees aren't pushing too far out or too far in. You're able to really stabilize and keep your knees over your toes. And what I mean by that is in line with your toes, in line with your feet. So again, sitting down, soft knees, sitting down. There's more of a sitting down really with goblet squats or with any kind of front-loaded squats versus doing a lot of pushing backwards. You're kind of set in this upright position. So you're really sitting down into that squatting pattern. All right, going to sumo squats. I'm utilizing a kettlebell for the sumo squat. You can also use back squat, kind of changes positioning a little bit, not really. Sometimes people will call this a sumo deadlift, depending on what you're using, depending on if it's touching the ground, you're picking it up. Apparently, if you're holding it, if you hold it here, it's a squat. If you hold it right there, then it's a deadlift. From my 2 cents, if I am getting set and I'm just holding it and I'm not picking it up off the floor, or I'm not emphasizing too much or prioritizing too much hinging, then I'll call it more of a squatting pattern. It pretty much depends on who you ask. Some people might call this a sumo deadlift. Again, depends on who you ask. Preference is just know the movement pattern. So feet, because feet are a little bit wider, now hip mobility plays a lot more of a factor. If you have tight adductors, if you have tight inner thighs, tight hamstrings, you're not going to be able to sit into this squat as much. You won't be able to broaden your stance out as much. Still, even with a wider stance, I still do about 45 degrees outward. This still allows for my knees, for my hips to rotate, to be able to sit into that squatting pattern. So as we kind of walk through, right, positioning, I'll still think, you want to think shoulders back, back flat. You want to think about bracing your core. I don't do the whole looking up, right? Neutral or a set position with your chin. Sometimes I'll look down. Sometimes I'll just make a double chin. If you notice on this left-hand side, I can draw over here, right? From hips all the way up, neutral. So really maintaining posture throughout this movement. So as I go through, soft knees, sit down into the movement, right? I'm still maintaining the same posture that I had. So let's drift over here. So think hips. So right there, you see soft knees, hips back and down. Sink, sink, sink. Here. Back up. A lot more emphasized on the glutes, a lot more emphasized on the hamstrings, mainly because in that position, we're already have a little bit more of stretched glutes, a lot more stretched hamstring, right? Your adductor is part of your hamstring system. So your hamstrings are already stretched in this state. And so now we are further utilizing the hamstrings throughout this movement pattern, maintaining posture. So maintaining a flat back. I really trying to emphasize drawing your shoulders backwards. But again, if we go back to, there's a box, sit on the box, right? It's not just a hinge. It's not just sitting straight down. We want to think about finding the box, sitting on the box, right? So find the box, sit on the box, back up, right? Also, just from a safety perspective, yes, when you come up, you'll notice squeeze your glutes, squeeze your legs. Do not push your hips all the way through. Do not try and get into the habit of a lot of people when they go through. Let me just delete these. A lot of people when they go through, right, they will push their hips beyond and kind of do this backwards tilt to really trying to emphasize glute activation, glute engagement, however you want to phrase that. It's okay to squeeze the musculature. It's okay to squeeze your glutes. It's okay to squeeze your legs, brace your core, keep your shoulders back. Don't overemphasize it to where you're hyperextending or to where you're leaning backwards. It's not going to be safe, going to put too much a toll on your skeletal structure. But if you're going a lot heavier, it's also not safe from a balance perspective, from being sure the weight is maintained in front of you and you're not, going to fall backwards on your heels and then even further than that. So from a safety perspective, yes, it's okay to squeeze at the top, but you're not exaggerating it to where you're shifting past where you started. You don't want to start like this is where I ended right here on this left-hand screen is where I started. You don't want to at the end go to where you started and then go past and really draw your shoulders back and drive your hips forward past where this posture is. So you just want to get back to that starting point. Again, it's okay to squeeze the muscles and really, really try and feel the muscles working. But it's not going to be good for you if you're constantly over exaggerating that movement pattern. Let's see if we can go to, what was our next one? Medicine ball squat. So a little bit of a variation here. So with our medicine ball, go ahead and clear drawings. With our medicine ball, very similar to the goblet squat. Difference is just how you're holding. So a Zercher squat, for those that may or may not be familiar, think about anytime think like a cradle, anytime you are holding something where it is placed or you're placing stress on like your biceps or on your elbows, and you think of holding something, that's going to be your Zercher carry. Sometimes you'll have a barbell that sits on the top of or the inside of your elbows, and you'll be holding, the bar like this and it's resting on the inside of your elbows. Great. That's Zercher carry or a Zercher hold. So just for reference, as far as terminology, a Zercher hold. And so very similar in nature to a goblet squat, upright positioning, a little bit more of a narrow stance, knees tracking over your toes, over your feet, and so forth. Nothing really changes in comparison to a kettlebell. I just want to make sure you see from a posture and a carry position that is going to be a Zercher hold. So similar musculature. Again, goblet squats place a lot more emphasis on the quadriceps. Same thing with this carry, because from a weight distribution standpoint, the weight is tracked in front of you. So we're placing a little bit more stress, yes, on our quadriceps, but also our core. Medicine balls usually don't get as heavy as kettlebells, so maybe as not much as a front squat or as a goblet squat. But my more main concern, not necessarily concern, but one thing to take note, because a medicine ball is a lot bigger than a kettlebell, per se, and you're outreached and in a Zercher carry, you're now having to really draw the medicine ball as close to you as possible. So if you're allowing the ball to be further, now you're exposing your shoulders throughout this movement. You're exposing your upper back and then placing a lot more strain on your lower back, right? So if we can keep our upper back tight, we're protecting our lower back. So I want you to keep that in mind. Anytime your upper back starts to fatigue and fail, all the emphasis drifts to the lower back. Now it works in one system. You want your lower back, your upper back, all to be one system. But even with a back squat or goblet squat, doesn't matter what it is. As you're going throughout the squatting pattern, if the upper back fails, now lower back takes over to the full extent, as much as possible, right? And so you really want to keep in mind, no matter what type of equipment you utilize, if you're here utilizing a medicine ball, and because it's wider, it's pulling you forward, you really want to make sure you keep your shoulders back and keep the ball as tight to you as possible. And that's where we go back to really tucking your elbows into your lats, really drawing your shoulder blades backwards and keeping that upright positioning throughout this movement. All right, next we'll look at a modification. This is usually looked at as a regression, but it's a great warm-up, and it's a really great way to teach how to sink down into a squat. Now, because I'm using a Swiss ball, because I'm using a wall as a platform for creating stability, I'm taking away your ability to sink your hips backwards. I'm taking away your ability to be able to navigate this sagittal plane from a stability perspective. I'm adding stability. You don't have to worry about forwards and backwards. You have to worry about side to side, but you don't have to worry about this forward to backwards aspect. So go ahead and start the video here. So as I initiate this, and what I will do is draw this line right here. I am in a fixed position here with this Swiss ball, right? So again, because I'm not pushing back, I'm not hinging, I'm not loading the hamstrings, I'm not loading the glutes, we are dominantly quadriceps here, right? I'm utilizing a lot of the front of my leg because I don't have to push my hips backwards. As I'm going through this movement, I'm sinking straight down. You'll notice a little bit of hips backwards just because I clear the Swiss ball, but from a difference in look at how upright I am in this position. I am almost as upright as possible. And really, if I want to lean my upper back more into the Swiss ball, then I could be as upright as possible, right? But from a comparison, a modification from a traditional back squat or body weight squat, I am completely upright. And now I'm placing all of the strain on my quadriceps. So I can integrate this if you're not used to squatting or you really want to teach squatting patterns and build a foundation first. It's a great way to incorporate a Swiss ball or a yoga ball or whatever you want to call the balance balls. I call them Swiss balls, just my personal preference. I've always heard it that way. It's a great way to incorporate as a learning tool for yourself, for clients, athletes, whoever it might be, but primarily for yourself to really ingrain this squatting pattern, but to teach you not just to sit back, but to sit down into the squat, right? Now I'm able to go lower into the squat, right? Even more of a depth than I could with any of the other variations of squatting patterns. But look how upright I am. I'm almost vertical, completely upright. And so it's really ingraining sitting down into the squat, back up. Because I'm utilizing a Swiss ball, because I'm taking away having to leverage, having to stabilize forwards and backwards, I'm not having to engage my core as much. Maybe if you're not necessarily bouncing on the ball and you're swaying back and forth and you're really having to engage your core, depends on the level, the strength of your core, but for the most part, I'm not necessarily having to engage my core. Plus, I'm not holding or utilizing any additional load, any additional weight. So I am primarily utilizing my quadriceps, sinking down, straight down into the squat. I actually, even if you're going to do a heavy lower body session or heavy squatting and squatting patterns with a barbell, whatever it might be, you can utilize this as part of your warm-up, right? Do 2-3 sets of 10 to 15 repetitions and really just work the legs, really just get used to sitting in that pattern. If you're going to pause at the bottom, stay there for a little bit. Maybe you do a couple of sets of maybe 5 to 8, but really it allows you to sink and open up your hips. Still do, if you're going to utilize this as a warm-up, still do a little bit of unilateral rotational dynamic stretching, but this is a great way to incorporate a little bit of movement preparation, a little bit of just working a movement pattern before you get into your main exercises. So going back, now I'm in the front view. Notice I'm upright. Stance is still similar to a goblet squat, sitting straight down. I'm able to maintain this upright positioning and then back up. So with the other variations of squatting, I'm having to engage my posterior chain. If you notice on the left, with goblet squats, even with back squats, right? I'm having to engage my core, but having to engage my upper back to maintain that upright positioning. I'm not having to worry about that here because I'm pushing into the Swiss ball. I'm utilizing that as a base of support. I am having to stabilize right and left, but from a forwards to backwards perspective, I'm not having to stabilize. All right, last we will look at this suspension trainer. Now I do place two variations here. Go ahead and knock out these videos. All right, I do two variations here. One on the left-hand side is where I have a pretty good lean, and I'm utilizing. So on the left-hand side, I'm utilizing my lean, right? And on the right-hand side, if you notice, I'm utilizing more as an assistance tool for, I don't want to fall forwards, right? And so based on how I'm leaning, utilizing this suspension system, this one is specifically a Liebert fitness system. You might commonly also see TRX systems. They're all suspension system trainers. But again, this just adds an aspect of stability, but while going through a range of motion. And really with these, you can even do variations of like pushing, pulling movements and different types of, depending on what system you're using, there's variations of how you can also incorporate or modify. But I just want to utilize this in the means of a suspension system, not necessarily a modification tool in a pushing, pulling pattern, but for a squatting pattern. So with the system, again, there can be two approaches. You can utilize this on the right-hand side where I just need this for support, just to go through a very traditional body squat pattern. I still have this forward lean. On the left-hand side, I'm utilizing it more of leaning backwards and sitting down into a squat. And so in comparison to the Swiss ball, the left-hand side, if I scoot my feet closer and lean back, I'm now getting more into a quadricep dominant, being able to sit down into the squat, versus on the right-hand side, I am just utilizing it as support. I bring it in a little bit more. And so now it still has a support system, but I'm incorporating the pattern I would for more of a body squat. So two variations of how you might approach utilizing the system. Again, one is outright and you have this lean, and the other one is where you're utilizing it more for a little bit of bracing, a little bit of modification if you want to have some sort of stability, but you don't want to rely on a different movement pattern. It's a great way to incorporate. So overall, these are just a couple of variations of squatting patterns, but hopefully it gives you a framework of, okay, the movement pattern squat or performing squatting patterns. This is how I can approach it. Here are some cues. Here are things to know, things to look out for, but just overall, just ways to incorporate it into your training. And later on in various other videos, presentations, courses, and so forth, we'll talk about incorporating it into a programming perspective, incorporating it into the longevity of improvements in performance, improvements in overall movement pattern health, and so forth.